The train station in Millhaven was not the kind of place you'd choose to be left behind. It was a small drafty building with flickering fluorescent lights and wooden benches worn smooth by decades of travelers passing through. On a Tuesday morning in February, when the temperature outside hovered just above freezing and the sky pressed down gray and low, there were maybe a dozen people scattered across the waiting area, bundled in their coats, staring at their phones or at the departure boards or at nothing at all. None of them noticed the woman sitting alone at the far end of the middle bench, her hands folded in her lap, her coat open because she had been too stunned to think about being cold. That woman was me. My name is Eleanor Voss. I am 67 years old. And my son-in-law had driven me 40 minutes from home, carried my overnight bag to the curb, handed me a train ticket I hadn't asked for, and told me very calmly that arrangements had been made for me to stay with my sister in Raleigh while the family sorted some things out. Then he got back in his car and drove away. I sat on that bench for a long time before I thought to open my purse. My wallet was not in it. Neither was my phone. I remembered setting them both on the kitchen counter that morning when Daniel said he needed help carrying something to the car. I had been in such a hurry to be helpful that I'd walked right out of my own house without them. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. I want to be honest with you about something before I go any further. When I tell this story, there is a version of me that wants to begin much earlier, before the train station, before Daniel, before my daughter Claire married a man who wore his ambition the way other men wore cologne. So constantly you stopped noticing it until you were already in a room with no windows. But if I start too early, I risk making this sound like a story about grievance. It isn't. Or rather, it didn't end that way. So let me start in the right place, which is 18 months before that Tuesday morning at the Millhaven station. My husband Gerald died in June, 3 years before this story begins. He was 71 and had been slowing down for the better part of a decade, so when the end came it was not a surprise, not exactly. What surprised me was how completely the quiet of the house swallowed me afterward. Gerald had not been a loud man. He was soft-spoken and methodical, the kind of person who read instruction manuals all the way through before assembling anything, who kept a small notebook in his breast pocket where he wrote down things he wanted to remember. But after he was gone, I understood that his presence had been filling space I hadn't known needed filling. The house where we'd lived for 34 years became something I had to negotiate with rather than simply inhabit. I managed. I want to say that clearly because it matters to the rest of this story. I was not a woman dissolving in grief. I joined the garden cooperative 2 blocks from the house. I took a watercolor class at the library on Thursday mornings. I cooked properly, kept the lawn tidy, called my daughter Claire every Sunday. I had a routine and it held me. What I did not have was money, at least not in the way people mean when they talk about someone being comfortable. Gerald and I had lived modestly. He was a high school biology teacher, and I had spent most of my adult life as a school librarian before taking early retirement when his health declined. We owned our house outright, and that was the solid center of our financial life. We had a modest savings account, Gerald's teacher pension, and my Social Security checks. It was enough to live on. It was not enough to inspire anyone to look twice. My daughter Claire had married Daniel Hurst 9 years before Gerald died. Daniel worked in commercial real estate, a field he approached with the focused intensity of someone who had decided very young that wealth was the only meaningful measure of a life, and had been working backward from that conclusion ever since. He was not unkind in the way that openly unkind people are. He didn't raise his voice or make cruel jokes. He simply had a quality of attention that moved past things he considered unimportant, and he had decided very early in our acquaintance that I was unimportant. The way he looked past me at family dinners, the way he answered questions I hadn't asked while my actual questions sat in the air unanswered. It took me several years to understand that this wasn't forgetfulness. It was evaluation. Daniel was always calculating the value of the people around him, and I had been assessed and filed away. Claire was a different matter. She had always been warm, curious, a little scattered in the way creative people often are. She painted in her spare time, large canvases full of color that didn't quite resolve into shapes but felt like something anyway. She had her father's gentleness and for a long time, her own strong sense of what was right. I don't know exactly when the balance in her marriage shifted. These things happen gradually and then all at once, like water wearing through stone. After Gerald died, Claire called more often. She and Daniel lived 40 minutes away in a larger house with a guest room that had its own bathroom and a window overlooking their small back garden. "Come stay with us," she said, the autumn after the funeral. "Just for a while. You shouldn't be alone so much." I went for a month and then another, and then, without anyone quite deciding it, I had moved the things that mattered most to me into their guest room and rented out my own house to a young couple who worked at the university. The rental income covered my expenses and then some. I felt for a time that this was the right arrangement. I could help with the grandchildren, Claire and Daniel had two, Marcus who was 11 and Sophie who was 8, and I could be useful in the daily ways that are their own kind of currency in a household. I did not understand, not for a long time, that Daniel's tolerance of my presence was contingent on a calculation he had made and not shared with anyone. The house on Birchwood Lane, my house, the one Gerald and I had bought in 1989 for $82,000, was now worth somewhere between $400,000 and $420,000 depending on which online estimator you consulted. Daniel had looked it up. I know this because I found the printout, tucked inside a folder in the home office with a sticky note that said only, Eleanor. Probate timeline? I put the folder back exactly as I'd found it and stood in the doorway of that room for a moment, thinking about what it meant that my son-in-law had been researching the probate timeline on my house while I was in the next room helping his daughter with her homework. I said nothing. I had learned by then that the most useful thing I could do was watch and wait, and that the people who underestimate quiet women are always the ones who end up surprised. Things began to change the following spring. Daniel had a new project, a large commercial development that required investors and leverage and the kind of patient financial architecture that he found genuinely exciting in the way other people find crossword puzzles or mountain hiking exciting. The project was going well, and then, over the course of about 6 weeks, it wasn't. The details trickled through in fragments. A partner who pulled out. A zoning approval that came back wrong. A bank that changed its terms at the last possible moment. I heard these things the way you hear weather reports through a closed window, present but muffled. What I understood clearly was that Daniel's mood shifted. He became more careful at dinner, more deliberate with his words, the way people are when they're managing something they don't want to spill. He stopped disappearing into his office immediately after meals and started lingering at the table, watching the children, watching Claire, watching me. One evening in April, I came downstairs for a glass of water around 10 o'clock and heard them talking in the kitchen. I wasn't trying to listen. I stopped in the hallway because you learn, when you live in someone else's house, to gauge the temperature of a room before entering it. "She's comfortable with us," Daniel was saying. "She's not going anywhere." Claire said something I couldn't make out. "We wouldn't have to sell," Daniel said. "We could use the rental income as collateral. Or better, if the property transfers to you as inheritance before she." And then one of them moved and I stepped back into the shadow of the staircase and waited until the kitchen light went out. I lay awake a long time that night. Not from distress exactly. More the way you lie awake when you've been handed a puzzle piece, and you're fitting it against the edges of pieces you already have. Gerald had left a will. It was simple and precise, the way Gerald was simple and precise. The house and everything in it went to Claire, with a note that expressed his hope, his words, that Eleanor would always have a home with her family. Not a legal provision. A hope. Gerald had trusted family the way he had trusted everything else, steadily, without armor. I had trusted it too, until the evening I stood in that hallway and heard my son-in-law calculating my life expectancy against a real estate investment timeline. I want to be fair to Claire here. I believe she was not the author of what came next. I believe she was someone being slowly persuaded that something difficult was also something reasonable, which is how reasonable people end up doing unreasonable things. Daniel was good at persuasion. It was what he did for a living, and he practiced it the way athletes practice, with discipline and incremental escalation. The first sign was the conversation about my rental income. Daniel raised it over dinner one evening in a tone of helpful concern, pointing out that the young couple renting my house had been there nearly 2 years, and that the rental agreement was coming up for renewal. Did I want him to handle the renewal? He knew a property manager who was very good, very reliable. It would take the administrative burden off my hands. I thanked him and said I would handle it myself. He nodded pleasantly and said of course, and the subject was closed. But something in the air was not. A week later, Claire mentioned, apparently casually, that Sophie's school was having some financial difficulties, and that they were considering a fundraising effort among families with means. She looked at me in a way that was not quite a request but leaned against one. I wrote a check because Sophie was my granddaughter and I loved her. I didn't think much about it until the same thing happened the following month in a different form. A car repair that had come up suddenly, a conference Daniel needed to attend that wasn't covered by his company's budget. The amounts were never large enough to alarm me. That, I understood later, was the point. Through all of this I maintained my routines. The garden cooperative. The watercolor class. My Sunday calls to my old friend Patrice, who still lived across town and who had known me since we were both young mothers pushing strollers through the same park, complaining about the same exhaustions. I didn't tell Patrice what was happening in the Hearst household, partly because I wasn't sure yet exactly what was happening, partly because I am a private person, which is a quality that looks like strength until it is used against you. What I did do in October of that year was drive to the offices of Calloway and Associates on the third floor of a building downtown with a law firm's discretion about its own exterior, and sit down with a man named Franklin Osei. I had found Franklin Osei the way I had found most things in my life that mattered, slowly, carefully, through the library. Not the public library this time, but the county law library, where I spent 3 Tuesday mornings reading about estate planning and the legal instruments available to people in situations that looked, at least on paper, something like mine. A reference librarian named Carol, who had the practical sympathy of someone who had spent 30 years helping people find answers to questions they were afraid to ask out loud, pointed me toward a list of estate attorneys who offered initial consultations at no charge. Franklin Osei was the third name on the list. He had a small office, a good handshake, and the quality that I have always found most reassuring in a professional. He listened more than he talked. I told him what I knew. The house. Gerald's will. Daniel's conversation about probate timelines. The gradual financial pressure that was small enough in each instance to be dismissed as coincidence. The rental property and my income from it. My social security and pension. My own modest savings. Franklin Osei did not react to any of this with alarm or surprise. He took notes in a small spiral notebook with a pen that had seen better days, and when I finished talking he asked several precise questions about the specific legal language in Gerald's will, about whether my name was on any shared accounts with Claire or Daniel, about whether I had signed anything since moving into their home. I had not signed anything. That, he said, was useful. He explained the options available to me, not in the manner of someone selling something, but in the manner of a person who understands that information clearly given is its own form of protection. We talked for an hour and a half. When I left I had a legal pad with notes in my own handwriting, and an appointment for the following Thursday. What happened over the 4 months that followed was not dramatic in the way dramatic things are supposed to be. It was quiet and methodical, and it happened below the surface of ordinary days, the way Gerald used to say the most important changes always happen invisibly and then all at once. I restructured my estate. The house on Birchwood Lane, my house, was placed into a revocable living trust. The trust named me as the trustee and the primary beneficiary during my lifetime. The successor trustee, the person who would manage it if I became incapacitated or after my death, was Franklin Osei, not Claire, not Daniel. The beneficiaries named in the trust were organizations I had chosen myself. The county library system, a literacy program I'd followed for years, and a scholarship fund at the high school where Gerald had taught for so long that the biology hallway still had a display case with a photo of him from 1998, when his students won the regional science fair. I did not do this out of anger. I want to be clear about that. I did it because I had sat in a hallway at 10 o'clock at night and heard my son-in-law speak of my death as a real estate event, and I had understood, with the particular clarity that comes from being underestimated for a very long time, that I needed to act while I still had the freedom to do so. I also did not tell anyone I had done it. The rental income continued to go into my own account. The checks I wrote to help with Sophie's school and Daniel's conference and Claire's car repair stopped, not abruptly, but with a gradual tapering that I managed through the gentle art of not being asked. I became less available for the kinds of soft financial requests that had been accumulating. I was always pleasant about it. Pleasantness is the most disarming tool available to a quiet woman who has decided to stop being quiet in the ways that matter. The real shift in the Hearst household came on a Monday evening in January, 7 months after my meeting with Franklin Osei. Daniel received a phone call during dinner. He excused himself with the particular tightness around his jaw that meant business, and he was gone for 20 minutes. When he came back, he sat down and ate the rest of his meal without speaking. Claire looked at him twice and then looked at her plate. After the children went to bed, I was in the guest room reading when I heard their voices through the wall. Not the words this time, just the rhythm, low and urgent, the kind of conversation that runs on a single anxious frequency for a long time. The next morning Daniel told me, with his pleasant, careful manner, that a change was coming. Claire had suggested, and he agreed, that it would be a wonderful opportunity for me to spend some extended time with my sister in Raleigh. Janice had been asking, hadn't she? And the kids had their school schedules, and with everything on his plate at work, they wanted to make sure I had proper company and support. I looked at him across the breakfast table. He was watching me with the attentive expression people use when they're expecting resistance and have already prepared for it. I said that sounded lovely and I would call Janice. He visibly relaxed. I called Janice. I explained the situation in enough detail that she understood without me having to say the thing I wasn't saying. Janice is 4 years older than me and has survived a divorce, a cross-country move, 2 knee replacements, and a decade of teaching 4th grade. She is not easily rattled. She said she would handle her end. I said I would handle mine. What I had not anticipated was the Tuesday morning. I thought Daniel would give me a week. People who are moving someone else out of their life usually give them a week, out of the minimum courtesy required to believe you are doing a reasonable thing. Daniel gave me 3 days. On the 3rd morning, he told me he had a train ticket for the 11:15 to Raleigh, and that he would drive me to the station. I packed my overnight bag, which was all he had given me time for. I set my wallet and phone on the counter for a moment, while I helped carry something to the car. And then I was on a bench in the Millhaven train station in February with open hands and no way to call anyone and no money for a cup of coffee. I sat with that for a while. I noticed the cold eventually. I noticed a vending machine in the far corner. I noticed a man in a gray overcoat at the ticket window whose posture, even from 40 feet away, had the quality of someone accustomed to waiting while the world moved around him. He turned from the ticket window and caught me looking. He didn't look away immediately, the way most people do when caught. He looked back steadily for a moment, and then he walked toward me. He sat down on the bench at a respectful distance, a space that said I am choosing to be near you without imposing on you, and he looked at the departure board for a moment before turning slightly in my direction. You look like you've had a morning, he said. His name, I would learn much later, was William Osei. He was Franklin's father. And sitting on that bench in his gray overcoat with the careful manner of someone who has learned to move through the world with the minimum required noise, he had no idea that the woman next to him was his son's most significant client, that the trust documents his son had drafted 4 months earlier had changed the legal structure of her estate in ways that were about to become very, very relevant, and that the son-in-law who had left this woman at a train station without her wallet was about to have a morning of his own. I asked William Osei if I might borrow his phone. He handed it to me without asking why. I called Franklin Osei's direct line, the one he had given me the first time I left his office with a legal pad full of notes. Franklin answered on the second ring. I told him where I was and what had happened. There was a pause, not of surprise exactly, more the pause of a man who has been waiting for a particular call, and is now recalibrating his schedule around it. Is your trust documentation in order? He asked. I told him it was. I told him the rental property had just been renewed with the property manager he had recommended, and that all accounts were current. Good, he said. Stay where you are. Someone will come. William Osei was watching the departure board when I handed his phone back. He had not looked at the screen while I was using it. Your son, I said, is a very good attorney. He smiled. He took care of that himself, he said. I just made sure he stayed out of trouble long enough to get to law school. We talked for 45 minutes while we waited. William Osei was 73. Retired from a career in civil engineering that had taken him across 3 continents before he settled back in the county where he'd grown up. He was traveling to see an old colleague in the next city. He had a quiet humor and the ease of someone who has made a separate peace with most of the things the world threw at him and emerged, not unscathed but intact. He did not ask me why I was at a train station without a wallet or a phone. He waited until I chose to tell him, which I did briefly, after about 20 minutes. He listened without shifting in his seat or offering his face as a mirror of appropriate reaction. He just listened. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "That's a particular kind of unkindness," he said. "When someone removes every tool you have for helping yourself and then decides you're helpless." I looked at him. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the board. Gerald would have liked this man, I thought. Gerald would have liked him very much. The woman who arrived 40 minutes later was not from Franklin's office. She was Carla, the paralegal who had helped draft my trust documents, and she carried in her left hand a manila envelope that contained a copy of the trust, a copy of the property deed, and a letter on Calloway and Associates letterhead that she had prepared before driving over, because Franklin Osei was a man who liked to have the right document available at the moment it was needed. She also brought my wallet because Franklin had called the Millhaven Police Department, explained the situation, and a patrol officer had gone to the Hearst house on Birchwood and retrieved it from the kitchen counter where I had left it. Daniel had opened the door and looked at the officer and said nothing. Claire had been standing in the hallway behind him. The officer had also retrieved my phone. I shook William Osei's hand before Carla and I left. He had a train to catch. He pressed my hand with both of his, the way people do when a handshake needs to carry more than a handshake can usually carry. "Take care of yourself," he said. I told him I intended to. I did not know then that I would see him again. That this would not be our last conversation in a train station waiting room. That the connection forged in 45 minutes of honest company would turn out to be one of the more significant ones of my late life, though not in the ways either of us could have anticipated. What I knew, as Carla drove me out of Millhaven and north toward the county seat where Franklin Osei's office was that a particular phase of my life had ended. The phase in which I deferred, accommodated, remained pleasantly invisible in the guest rooms of people who were calculating my worth in terms of what they stood to receive after my death. That phase was done. What I did not know, what Daniel Hearst did not know, and what Claire Hearst was only beginning to suspect, was that the legal architecture Franklin Osei had helped me build over the previous 4 months was about to become the most relevant set of documents in any room it entered. The train station had been the ending of something. The drive north was the beginning of something else. Daniel Hearst's boss, the man who signed his performance reviews and his year-end bonuses and whose approval determined the trajectory of every significant deal in Daniel's professional life, was a man named Robert Calloway. Robert Calloway was Franklin Osei's senior partner, and Franklin Osei had been about to make a phone call. Franklin Osei's office was on the 3rd floor of a building that had once been a textile warehouse before someone in the 1990s had the sensible idea of putting lawyers in it. The floors were original wide plank wood. The windows were tall and let in the kind of winter light that makes everything look considered rather than accidental. And the bookshelves that lined the walls of Franklin's office held not just legal volumes but novels, a small ceramic elephant on the middle shelf, and a framed photograph of a younger William Osei standing in front of something large and structural in what looked like West Africa. Carla showed me in and brought coffee without asking how I took it, which told me she had read the file before coming to the train station. Franklin was behind his desk. He stood when I came in, which I noticed because it is the kind of thing that tells you who someone is, the small physical courtesies that haven't been calculated but simply are. "Mrs. Voss," he said. "I'm glad you called." I told him I was glad I had his number memorized. At my age, I said, you keep the numbers that matter somewhere other than a phone. He smiled at that. "Please sit down." We spent the first 10 minutes going through what had happened in practical terms. The train ticket had been purchased one way, Millhaven to Raleigh, with no return. My overnight bag contained 2 days of clothing. My wallet, now returned, was intact. The cash was there, the cards were all present, nothing had been touched. My phone was on and working. Franklin looked at all of this with the methodical attention of someone who is assembling a picture from its component pieces. Has Daniel ever had access to your accounts? He asked. No. Not since I restructured. Has he asked to be added to any accounts in the past year? He asked once, I said. About 8 months ago. He framed it as streamlining household finances. I told him I had everything managed and changed the subject. Franklin wrote something in his notebook. Good. I asked him about the phone call. The one he had said he was going to make. He looked up from the notebook. He chose his words with the care of someone who understands that certain sentences, once spoken, become part of the record of a situation. Robert Calloway is the founding partner of this firm, he said. He's also Daniel Hurst's direct supervisor at Meridian Commercial Group. Robert sits on Meridian's advisory board. He's been in that role for 11 years. I looked at him. Robert is a good man, Franklin said. He has views about how people in his organization conduct themselves, particularly when it concerns the treatment of family members in vulnerable circumstances. I want to be clear about something, I said. I'm not interested in destroying my son-in-law. I'm interested in making sure he understands precisely and permanently that what he did this morning has consequences. And I'm interested in making sure my daughter has the information she needs to make her own choices. Franklin nodded slowly. That is a reasonable set of goals. I'm also interested, I said, in going home. He looked at me. To my house, I said. My house on Birchwood Lane. Not to the Hurst guest room. My house where the young couple whose lease has just expired have already been notified. Because I asked the property manager to send the non-renewal notice 2 weeks ago. Franklin set his pen down. You planned for this. I didn't plan for the train station specifically, I said. But I planned for a version of it. Gerald used to say that wisdom isn't knowing what will happen. It's knowing the shape of what might happen and making sure you're dressed for it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Robert Calloway knew your husband. I looked up. Gerald Voss. He taught at Millhaven High for 26 years. Robert's youngest son was in his class in 2001. Biology. Robert has mentioned him more than once over the years. He has a particular regard for teachers. I didn't know what to do with that information immediately, so I simply filed it. It would matter later. And I had learned to trust that things file themselves in the right place if you let them. Franklin made his phone call that afternoon while I sat in the small waiting area off the main hallway and looked at the framed architectural drawings on the wall, which I later learned were plans for a bridge William Osei had engineered in the 1980s. Carla brought more coffee. Outside, the February light went flat and silver against the tall windows and then began to fade. I did not hear the call. I did not try to. What I knew was that it lasted 42 minutes, because I looked at my watch when Franklin disappeared into his office and again when he came out. He stood in the doorway. Robert would like to meet with you, he said. If you're willing. When? He said tomorrow morning if that works. He said to tell you he's sorry for what happened to you today, and that he would very much like a conversation. I said tomorrow morning would be fine. That night I stayed at Patrice's house. I had called her from Franklin's office and she had said come, just come. And when I arrived she had the guest room turned down and soup on the stove and the particular quality of presence that very old friends have, the ability to be company without requiring anything from you. We ate at her kitchen table and talked about things that had nothing to do with Daniel Hurst or estate trusts or train stations. We talked about her garden and about a book we'd both read the previous autumn and about Gerald and about her late husband Thomas and about the way time does strange accounting with grief, taking some things and leaving others in ways you can never predict. You should have told me earlier, she said when I finally told her the shape of it. No. You never ask for help. I asked today, I said. At a train station from a stranger who turned out to be exactly the right stranger. She looked at me over her soup bowl. The strange thing about asking for help, she said, is that it always seems like it will cost you something. And then you do it and it turns out it cost the other person almost nothing and gave you almost everything. I thought about William Osei handing me his phone without asking why. Yes, I said. That is exactly right. If you're hooked on this story, Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. I met Robert Calloway the following morning at 9 o'clock in a conference room in his building 4 blocks from Franklin's office. He was 68, a broad-shouldered man with gray hair worn short and the kind of face that has been lived in generously, with deep lines around the eyes that come from both weather and laughter. He shook my hand with both of his, which I noticed, and he thanked me for coming, which he said with a sincerity that was different from the performative gratitude of someone who wants something from you. He said, "Mrs. Voss, I've known Daniel Hurst for 7 years. He's been a productive member of my team. He's also been a man I've had certain private reservations about, for reasons I hadn't yet found the professional occasion to address. Yesterday gave me that occasion." I asked him what he meant by private reservations. He leaned back in his chair. "Daniel is excellent at the transactional parts of real estate," he said. "He understands leverage and timing, and he reads markets accurately. What he hasn't developed in 7 years under my supervision is any real understanding of the difference between a transaction and a relationship. He treats people the way he treats properties, as assets to be acquired, held as long as they're useful, and divested when they're not." I listened. "What he did yesterday," Robert continued, "leaving his wife's mother at a train station without identification or a means of communication in February, is not something I can treat as a private family matter. Not when it involves one of this firm's clients, and not when it reflects a pattern of judgment that touches on how he conducts himself professionally. I want to be honest with you," I said. "My goal is not his termination." He looked at me carefully. "My goal is proportionate consequence," I said. "Something that makes clear to him and to my daughter that what happened has a weight to it. But I have grandchildren. I have a daughter who made a choice and is going to have to live inside it. Burning the whole structure down doesn't serve any of them." Robert was quiet for a moment. "Franklin told me you might say something like that," he said. "Franklin knows me better than most." "What do you want?" he asked. "Specifically, I want to go home," I said. "I want to live in my house, which is legally structured in a way that protects it from any future claim by anyone other than the people and organizations I have chosen. I want my daughter to have all the information she needs to understand what her husband was planning, in whatever form allows her to make a real decision rather than a managed one. And I want Daniel to experience a professional consequence that is real and lasting, but not catastrophic." Robert folded his hands on the table. "I can do most of that," he said. He explained what he had in mind. Daniel would be formally placed on a professional performance review, triggered by a conduct concern that Robert would document carefully. The review was real and had teeth. It would affect Daniel's bonus structure and his eligibility for the 2 significant project leads he was currently positioned to take on. It would not be termination, but it would be a reckoning, the kind that stays in a professional record and changes the calculations a person makes going forward. More significantly, Robert had already contacted the property attorneys who had been involved in Daniel's stalled commercial development, the project that had failed the previous autumn. There were questions about how certain investor relationships had been managed. Robert had not raised them before because the project's failure was, on the surface, a business matter. Now he raised them because the pattern of how Daniel handled assets he considered his own had become relevant to how he handled professional ones. "I don't know what you'll find," I said. "Neither do I," Robert said. "But I think it's worth looking." We shook hands at the end of that meeting. At the door he paused. "Gerald Voss," he said. "He taught my son Michael in 2001. Michael was failing biology in October of that year, and your husband stayed after school with him 3 days a week from October to December. Michael passed with a B. He went on to study environmental science. He works for a conservation organization in Costa Rica now. He has for 11 years. I looked at him. "I went to the high school's memorial service when Gerald died," Robert said. "I was in the back. I didn't think you'd remember me." "I didn't. I'm sorry." "Don't be. There were a lot of people who owed Gerald Voss something they never got to repay." He paused. "I suppose this is a version of repayment. Indirect, late, and through a stranger you happen to be left beside at a train station. But I think Gerald would appreciate the improbability of it." I had to look away for a moment, out the tall window at the February street below. Yes, I said. He would have found that very funny. I went home that afternoon. The house on Birchwood Lane was exactly as I had left it. The young couple, Teresa and Mark, had been prompt and thorough tenants, and the small personal touches they had made. A plant on the kitchen windowsill, a rug in the entryway that was not mine, had already been removed because they are considerate people who understood the difference between borrowing a space and claiming it. I stood in the hallway for a moment with my overnight bag and just breathed the particular smell of it, old wood and something floral that I have never been able to attribute to anything specific, which I have come to believe is simply the smell of a house that has been loved consistently for 34 years. I put my bag down. I went into the kitchen and filled the kettle. Gerald's chair was still at the head of the table. I sat in it, which I had not done in 3 years. Felt exactly like sitting in it always had. Called Claire that evening. She answered on the first ring, which meant she had been holding her phone. "Mom," she said. Her voice had the particular quality of someone who has been crying and has run out of new things to cry about and has arrived at something calmer on the far side of it. "I'm at home," I said. "Birchwood Lane." "I'm fine." "I know. Daniel told me Franklin Osei called." She paused. "He told me other things too." I let her be quiet for a moment. "He told me about the search he did," she said. "The probate thing." "Mom, I didn't know about that." "I want you to know I didn't know." "I believe you. But I knew something," she said. I knew he was thinking about money in ways that she stopped. I let him talk me into things. She stopped again. "I don't know how to explain how that happens." "You don't need to explain it to me," I said. "You need to understand it for yourself." She was quiet for a long time. "Are you angry?" I thought about that honestly. "I was angry on the bench in the train station," I said. "For about 20 minutes. Then I was cold, and then I was practical, and then I was talking to a very decent man who lent me his phone, and the anger got smaller. It's still there. But it's not the biggest thing." "What's the biggest thing?" "I want you to have all the information," I said. "About the trust. About what Franklin found when he looked at Daniel's professional situation. About what Robert Calloway is doing and why. I want you to have it all, not from Daniel's version and not from mine, but from the documents and the facts. And then I want you to make your own decisions." She said nothing for a moment. Then, "Did you know Daniel's boss knows you?" "I know now." "Did you plan that?" "No," I said. "Some things you plan. Some things the world arranges on your behalf. And wisdom is knowing how to receive them when they arrive." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Very quiet and not quite all the way there, but almost. "Mom," she said. "I'm sorry. I know. The children miss you. Tell them to call me on Saturday morning," I said. "I'll make pancakes and we'll talk on video. And Claire, whatever you decide about everything else, I need you to understand one thing clearly." "What?" "I'm not going anywhere. I'm right here in my house, which is exactly where I intend to stay. And whatever happens with you and Daniel, you are my daughter and Marcus and Sophie are my grandchildren, and that doesn't depend on any of the rest of it." She cried then properly, the way she had probably needed to cry for hours. I held the phone and waited. When she was done, she said, "How are you so calm about all of this?" I looked around Gerald's kitchen, at the kettle on the stove and the plant that needed watering and the chair I was sitting in. "I've had a long time to practice," I said. The first week back in my house was quiet in a way that felt earned rather than empty. I opened all the windows in the mornings even though it was still February, just for 10 minutes, just to let the air move through. I went back to the garden cooperative, where a woman named Helen had been looking after my plot and had kept it in better shape than I deserved. I went back to the Thursday watercolor class. I slept in my own bed and heard my own floors and ate breakfast at the table where Gerald and I had eaten breakfast for 34 years. And the grief of missing him was present, but it was clean grief, the kind that sits alongside you rather than on top of you. Patrice came on Friday and we walked the neighborhood for an hour in the cold. She wanted to know everything and I told her most of it, the parts that were mine to tell. She was satisfyingly appalled about the train station and satisfyingly unsurprised about Daniel and satisfyingly accurate about Claire in the way that people who have known you for 40 years are accurate about your family even when they haven't met them. "He targeted your tolerance," Patrice said. People like that always do. They find someone who won't make a scene and they treat it as permission. I know. What happens now? I shrugged my coat up against the wind. Now I live my life, I said. And the consequences of what he did continue to arrive in the order they're going to arrive in. She looked at me sideways. You know something you're not saying. I always know something I'm not saying. That's different from hiding it. She shook her head, smiling. 67 years old, she said. Still the most annoying person I know. It was around this time, the second week of February, that I received a call from Franklin Osei with news I had not expected but perhaps, in some quiet part of myself, had hoped for. The review of Daniel's failed commercial development had turned up something. It wasn't criminal, Franklin was careful to say. But it was material. One of the early investors in the project, a woman named Patricia Glendon who had put in $200,000 based on Daniel's representations about the project's risk profile, had not received the disclosure documents that would have allowed her to accurately assess those risks. The omission was, on paper, an administrative error. In context, given the pattern of how Daniel managed information with people he had categorized as unsophisticated, his own word, found in an email, it was something more. Robert Calloway was handling the professional dimension. Patricia Glendon's attorney was handling the civil dimension. Franklin was handling the dimension that involved making sure I was fully informed and fully protected, which was the dimension I cared about most. The performance review Daniel had been placed on was converted to a formal probationary status. The two project leads he had been positioned for were reassigned. His bonus for the previous year, which had not yet been paid, was held pending the outcome of the Glendon matter. I heard all of this from Franklin in the same calm telephone manner with which he delivered any other piece of legal information, and I listened in the same calm manner with which I had received every piece of information in the 4 months since I had first sat in his office. When he finished, I thanked him and asked whether there was anything I needed to sign or review. "There's one more thing," he said. I waited. "My father asked me to pass something along. He said to tell you that the train to the city runs every Tuesday and Thursday morning, and that if you ever happen to be on it, he usually takes the 9:15 and he sits in the third car and he would be glad of the company." I was quiet for a moment. "Your father is 73 years old," I said. "He is," Franklin said, with the particular tone of a son who has decided to stay out of a situation. I thanked him and ended the call and sat for a while in Gerald's chair. Gerald had always said that life's best developments were the ones that arrived sideways, through a door you weren't watching. He had said this first about a job offer, then about a house, then about me. I'm going to go ahead and tell you that I found this funny and somewhat terrifying, and that I sat with it for several days before I did anything about it at all. What was happening with Daniel and Claire in those weeks was a different kind of slow. Claire had engaged her own attorney, not to initiate divorce proceedings, not yet, but to understand exactly what their shared financial situation looked like and what her options were. This is a different thing from deciding, and I want to be precise about it because it matters. Claire was a person who had allowed herself to be slowly reorganized around someone else's agenda, and the first step back from that is simply seeing the full map. Not choosing a direction yet, just seeing. Daniel, to his credit, did not behave badly when the structure he had built started showing its cracks. He did not rage. He did not take it out on the children or make ugly accusations. He contracted inward the way people do when they are genuinely frightened, and he went quiet in the way that is different from the managed quietness of someone controlling a room. He had understood, I think fairly quickly after Robert Calloway's call, that the architecture he had been working within had shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated, and that the woman he had left at a train station had been several moves ahead of him for the better part of a year. He called me once. It was a Wednesday evening 3 weeks after the train station. I answered. He said, "Eleanor, I need you to know that I didn't plan for it to happen the way it did that morning." "That wasn't what was it?" I asked. He was quiet. "I don't ask that to be cruel," I said. "I ask because I think you should know exactly what it was. It was the natural outcome of how you had been thinking about me for at least 2 years. Not a bad morning. Not a lapse of judgment. The thing that happens when people who categorize other people as tools stop maintaining the pretense." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "I'm sorry. For whatever that's worth." "I'm sure you are," I said. I think you're also sorry about Robert and the Glendon situation and the performance review. And I think the sorrow is real even if the sequencing of it is instructive. A longer silence. I want you to know something, I said. Not for your comfort. Just because it's true. I have never wanted your marriage to fail. I have never wanted your career to be damaged beyond recovery. I have wanted very specifically and from the beginning to be treated as a person whose life and choices and legal rights have weight. That's all. What happens from here is the result of a choice you made. And the choices that follow from it are yours and Claire's to make. He said. Did you know about Robert? Before. No, I said. I knew the trust was solid. I knew Franklin was competent. I did not know that his senior partner had a son who stayed after school with Gerald every Tuesday and Thursday for 3 months in 2001. That particular piece the world arranged on its own. He was quiet for so long I thought he might have set the phone down. I should go, I said. Take care of those children. I ended the call and put the phone on the kitchen counter and stood at the sink and looked out at the back garden, where the February ground was still hard and the rose canes I had cut back in autumn were bare and dark against the fence. In another 2 months they would have new growth on them. They always did every year without anyone asking them to, without anyone praising them for it. This is the thing about quiet persistence that I have tried to understand and practice my whole life. It doesn't look like power while it's happening. It looks like patience. It looks like accommodation. It looks like an old woman sitting in a guest room reading while the household moves around her. And then the ground shifts and the structure that was built on other people's assumptions meets the structure that was built on legal documents and careful planning and 42 minutes of honest company with a stranger at a train station, and everyone learns which one was actually solid. Spring came. The roses came back as they always did. I took the 9:15 train to the city one Thursday in March. I sat in the third car. William Osei was reading a history of the Panama Canal, and made room for my bag without being asked. We talked for the 50-minute ride the way people talk when they have already dispensed with the formalities at a train station bench in February and can go straight to the things that actually interest them. He had opinions about bridge design and about the novel I was carrying and about a terrible film adaptation of a book we had both loved 20 years apart. He had a granddaughter who wanted to study engineering. He had learned to make a West African groundnut soup that he described as a work in progress, which I suspected was a deliberate understatement. I told him about the garden, about Gerald, about the watercolor class and the cooperative and Patrice and the way the house on Birchwood Lane smelled in the morning when you opened the windows even in winter. He listened in the way he had listened at the train station, with full attention and without the particular restlessness of someone waiting for their turn to speak. It was, I thought again, the quality of a man who had been genuinely interested in the world for 73 years, and had not run out of things to be interested in. When we arrived at the city, we stood on the platform for a moment before the crowd separated us toward our different errands. Same time next week? He asked. I told him I had watercolor on Thursdays. He thought about this. The following Thursday I'm going to see my granddaughter's science presentation at her school. The one after that I have no fixed plans. 2 Thursdays from now, I said. Third car. He smiled. He had Gerald's kind of smile, I thought. The kind that happens in the eyes a fraction of a second before it reaches the mouth so that you always feel it's been meant. He went one way and I went another, down the station stairs and out into the March morning, where the air had finally given up on winter and was moving with something that was almost warmth. I had errands in the city. A meeting with Franklin about some final adjustments to the trust documentation. Lunch with a woman from the garden cooperative, who had a sister living near the museum district, and who had suggested we make a day of it. A bookshop I had been meaning to visit for 2 years that turned out to be exactly what a bookshop should be. Slightly too warm, organized by some logic I couldn't fully decode but trusted anyway, with a cat asleep on the poetry shelf. I bought 3 books. I had soup for lunch in a restaurant where the windows looked out on a street full of people going somewhere with purpose, and I watched them with the pleasure of someone who is also going somewhere with purpose and whose purpose is, at the moment, entirely her own. That evening on the train back to Millhaven I called Claire. She answered on the second ring. How was the city? She asked. Sophie told me you were going. Good, I said. I had lunch with Dorothy from the cooperative and I found a bookshop I'm going to need to visit regularly. Mom. Yes. She paused. I've been thinking about what you said. About having all the information and making my own decisions. And? I have the information, she said. I've had it for a few weeks. I've been sitting with it. I know. I've been letting you. She was quiet for a moment. I think I knew something was wrong before the train station, she said. I think I'd known for a while. It's easier to keep moving than to stop and look at what you're moving away from. Yes, I said. I understand that. I'm not sure what I'm going to do yet. You don't have to be sure yet. The kids are okay, she said. They're confused and quieter than usual, but they're okay. I've been very straightforward with them about the fact that Mom and Dad are working through some things and that it doesn't change anything about how much we both love them. That's exactly right. She made a sound. You always know what the exactly right thing is. No, I said. I just lived long enough to know what the wrong things usually look like. The train moved through the early evening, through the places where the city gives way to suburb and suburb gives way to the wider, quieter spaces. I watched the windows and thought about Gerald and about William Osei, and about the particular mercy of arriving at this stage of a life with the house still standing and the roses coming back and the people who love you still on the phone. There's one more thing you should know, I told Claire. What? The trust is set up the way it is for a reason. I want you to understand that it was never about you. It was about making sure that no one's financial calculations about my life could override my legal rights over my own home and my own choices. That protection exists regardless of anything that happens with your marriage or your household. You are my daughter and that is separate from any of it. She was quiet for a long time. Then I know, Mom. I think I've always known who you are. For a while I let someone else's version of you be louder than the real one. I'm still here, I said. The real one? Yeah, she said. I know. We said goodnight and I put the phone in my bag. And the train came into Millhaven station and I gathered my things and stepped out onto the platform where, 6 weeks before, I had been the woman with the empty hands. The platform was cold and lit with the particular orange of station lights in early darkness. A few other passengers moved past me toward the exit. I stood for a moment not because I needed to, but because there is something clarifying about standing in the place where a hard thing happened and feeling that the ground under your feet is solid. It was solid. I walked to my car in the station lot. I drove the 7 minutes to Birchwood Lane. I unlocked my own front door, which opened exactly as it always had, with the slight resistance at the top that Gerald had always meant to fix and never got around to. I went inside and turned on the lights. The Patricia Glendon matter resolved in April, on a Tuesday morning when the dogwood tree in my back garden was in full bloom, and the light through the kitchen window had turned that particular gold that only happens for about 3 weeks in spring before the leaves come in too thick and change the quality of everything. Franklin called me at 9:15, which was precise of him because he knew I was usually back from my morning walk by 9 and settled with coffee by 9:10. The settlement was finalized last night, he said. Patricia Glendon will receive $260,000, which is her principal plus reasonable damages. Daniel Hurst has signed a formal acknowledgement of the disclosure failures. I asked whether the acknowledgement was a matter of record. It is, Franklin said. It will be visible to anyone conducting due diligence on him professionally. Not a criminal conviction, but a real thing that stays. I thought about Patricia Glendon, whom I had never met, who had handed $200,000 to a man who had categorized her as unsophisticated and had managed her information accordingly. I thought about all the Patricia Glendons there probably were, in various configurations, in the professional history of a man who treated people as assets and managed them accordingly. Is she all right? I asked. Franklin paused, which was not something he did often. She is, he said. She asked me to pass something along to you. To me? She knows the review of Daniel's conduct originated from a complaint related to a client of this firm. He said carefully. She doesn't know details. But she asked me to tell the person responsible that she is grateful, and that she has a daughter about your age who she is going to call today. I sat with that for a moment. Tell her she's welcome, I said. After I hung up I finished my coffee and went out to the garden and stood for a while near the dogwood. Gerald had planted it the spring Marcus was born, our first grandchild, because he said every new person deserved a tree. It was 11 years old now, and it was magnificent white flowers against the April sky, completely indifferent to everything that had happened in the house behind it and entirely committed to its own particular work. I thought about what Patrice had said on our February walk. He targeted your tolerance. And I thought about how the reverse of that is also true, that the people who underestimate you are always working from an outdated model of who you are, built from observations of who you were when you were being accommodating, and that the gap between that model and the real thing is where their surprises come from. Daniel had built a very detailed picture of an elderly woman who was financially modest, socially isolated, and unlikely to cause trouble. He had been meticulous about it, noticing every small accommodation I made, every gentle deflection, every time I smiled and said that sounds lovely and went to call someone. He had taken all of that careful observation and arrived at the wrong conclusion, which is what happens when you observe behavior without understanding the person behind it. Gerald used to tell his students that the most dangerous mistake in biology was mistaking adaptation for weakness. A thing that bends in the wind, he would say, has not given up. It has decided the wind is temporary and it knows how to wait. I went back inside and called Marcus. He answered with the particular energy of an 11-year-old who has been waiting for the phone to ring, which was either a coincidence or meant that Claire had told him Grandma might call, which seemed more likely. "Grandma," he said, "when are you coming over? When would you like me to come over?" "Sophie says Saturday, but I say Friday because Saturday we have the game and you always come to the game, but also I want to show you the thing I made in science." "Both," I said. "I'll come Friday for science and Saturday for the game." He made a sound of pure satisfaction and then, with the conversational abruptness of children who consider transitions optional, said, "Grandma, is everything okay? Like with the family stuff?" I looked out the kitchen window at the dogwood. "Everything is going to be okay," I said. "It's one of those times when things need to shift a bit before they settle. But the important things are solid. Like you and me? Exactly like that." He thought about this for a moment with the serious consideration that Marcus brought to most things, which he had inherited from Claire and, I like to think, from Gerald, who had always believed that children's questions deserved the same honest attention as any other question. "'Kay," he said. "Friday at 4? Friday at 4. The Friday visit was important for reasons I hadn't fully anticipated. Daniel was there. I had not known he would be. Claire hadn't told me, which I understood later was because she wasn't sure herself whether he was going to come, and she had decided not to pre-manage the situation in either direction. This was itself a kind of progress, the willingness to let things be what they were rather than arranging them into a more comfortable shape in advance. He was in the kitchen when I came in, standing at the counter with a cup of coffee, and the posture of someone who has been working very hard at looking natural and has not entirely succeeded. He said Eleanor in a voice that was careful, and without the confident pleasantness that had always characterized his manner with me before. Something had gone out of it, the managed quality, and what was left was plainer and, I thought, more honest. "Daniel," I said. "The children were a mercy." Marcus pulled me immediately toward the dining room table where his science project was set up, a model of a water filtration system made from plastic bottles and gravel and sand, and a great deal of enthusiasm. Sophie appeared from upstairs and attached herself to my left arm with the proprietary affection that 8-year-olds deploy without self-consciousness, and for 45 minutes the house was full of the ordinary noise of a family afternoon, which is its own kind of medicine. Claire made tea. Daniel stayed in the kitchen for most of it, occasionally appearing in the doorway, occasionally catching my eye with the expression of someone who has a great deal to say, and has correctly identified that this is not the moment. After Marcus had demonstrated his filtration system and Sophie had shown me a drawing she had made of the horse she intended to own someday, and the children had migrated back toward their own business, Daniel came and sat across from me at the dining room table. Claire was nearby, not intervening, just present in the way she had learned to be present, without managing. "I want to say something," Daniel said. "Not to explain. Just to say." I waited. "I spent a long time thinking of this house and your house and all of it as a problem to be solved," he said. "And I spent a long time thinking of you as part of the problem." He looked at his hands on the table, then back up. "I understand now that I had it exactly backwards. You weren't the problem. You were the person who knew exactly what was happening, and handled it better than I deserved. I looked at him across the table. He was 44 years old and he looked, in that moment, younger than that, in the way people look younger when they have stopped performing a version of themselves and are just sitting with what's true. "What are you going to do with that understanding?" I asked. He was quiet. "I don't know yet," he said. "I'm trying to figure out what I actually value. I think I have been trying to figure that out for a while but using the wrong tools." "That's honest," I said. "It's all I've got right now," he said. "I thought you should know it's there." I looked at this man who had left me at a train station in February with empty hands and no way to call for help. And I thought about what it means to keep a door open versus walking through it. The door can be open for a long time before anyone goes through it, and that is not a failure of the door. "I appreciate you saying that," I said. "Do right by those children. Everything else will sort itself out." He nodded. Claire put her hand briefly on his shoulder as she passed, which was not a declaration of anything except that they were two people in the same house trying to move forward. And that is its own kind of beginning. I drove home that evening through the spring dark with the windows down, thinking about how much of life is the space between what happens and what happens next. The train station was the thing that happened. What was happening now was the space after it, full of incomplete decisions and genuine attempts, and the ordinary work of people who have been given a hard truth and are trying to build something real out of what's left. Robert Calloway called me the following Monday. I had not spoken to him since our February meeting, though Franklin had kept me informed about the professional dimensions of what had followed. I was surprised to hear his voice directly, that particular warm practicality that I had noticed at our meeting. "Mrs. Voss," he said. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all. I'm calling because something has come up that I wanted to discuss with you directly before it happens because it involves Gerald." I put down the dish towel I was holding. "Millhaven High School is naming their new science wing after Gerald," he said. "The announcement is next month. The school board approved it last week. I've been on their advisory committee for several years and I want you to know that while I did advocate for it when the opportunity arose, the decision was made on the merits of his record. 26 years, Mrs. Voss. The science department chairs who trained under him, the students who went on to careers in the sciences, the programs he built. The record spoke for itself." I sat down. "There's a dedication ceremony," he continued, "on May the 15th. I would be very glad if you would come. Michael is flying in from Costa Rica. He asked specifically whether you would be there." "Michael," I said. "Your son." "He said that if Mrs. Voss is there, he would know it's right," Robert Calloway said, and there was something in his voice that told me he had been sitting with this for a while, and that saying it out loud had moved him in some way he hadn't entirely prepared for. I looked out the kitchen window at the dogwood, past full bloom now, the flowers going soft at the edges. "I'll be there," I said. I called William that evening. We had spoken several times since the Thursday trains began. Phone calls in the evenings that had the quality of conversations continued rather than started, the kind you have with someone when there is more to say than any one occasion can hold. I told him about the science wing. He was quiet for a moment. "Gerald Voss," he said, "the way people say a name when they are holding it with care." "You would have liked him," I said. "I think I already do," he said. "From everything you've described." There was a pause that was comfortable in the way silences are comfortable when you have stopped needing to fill them. "Will you come?" I asked. "To the ceremony?" He said. "I was hoping you would ask that." The weeks between that conversation and the May 15th ceremony were the most ordinary weeks I had spent in years, which is to say they were full of the texture of a life being actually lived. The garden was in its full spring momentum. I had started a new series of watercolors at the Thursday class. Landscapes of the neighborhood that my instructor said had more confidence in them than my earlier work. Whether she meant artistic confidence or something else I wasn't entirely sure, but I thanked her and kept going. Marcus called me on a Sunday evening with a question about his science homework that turned into a 40-minute conversation about how water moves through the ground, which is a subject I know more about than most people because Gerald talked about it for 26 years. Sophie sent me a drawing of the horse she intended to own, revised to include a second horse that was apparently mine, which I found on my phone one morning and which made me laugh in a way that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. Claire and I spoke twice a week, sometimes more. We did not always talk about Daniel or the marriage or the decisions still pending. Sometimes we talked about the watercolors. Sometimes she talked about her paintings, the large canvases that she had returned to after years of not painting, and I listened to her describe them with the particular quality of someone who has found their way back to something they had let themselves be talked out of. She sounded like herself in a way she hadn't sounded in years. I did not say this out loud because some observations are better kept as the warm private thing they are. Patrice took me to lunch in late April and told me over soup that she had noticed I sounded different. Different how, I asked. Less like someone managing something, she said. More like someone living something. I thought about that. There is a difference, I said. Enormous difference, she agreed. The thing I want to say about those weeks, the thing I find it hardest to say precisely, is about what it feels like when the thing you were afraid of turns out to be survivable. Not just survivable in the sense of you got through it, but survivable in the sense of you got through it and found on the other side that the things you were trying to protect were still there. The house was still there. The garden was still there. The children were still reachable and still wholly themselves. The friendships that had been there for 40 years were still there. And there were new things, a Thursday train and a man who read history on long rides and had opinions about soup, and a Friday afternoon science demonstration from an 11-year-old who believed water filtration was more important than it was being given credit for, and he was probably right. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The May 15th ceremony was on a Thursday, which meant I took the 9:15 with William and we rode to the stop nearest Millhaven High and walked the 4 blocks to the school in the May morning, which was warm without being hot, the kind of day that feels like a decision the weather has made thoughtfully. The new science wing was made of glass and steel that had been designed to sit alongside the old brick of the main building without competing with it, which I thought Gerald would have approved of. He had always had a preference for things that knew how to coexist. The wing had been completed the previous autumn and had been operating all year, but the formal naming and dedication had been held until the right moment, which turned out to be this one. There were perhaps 200 people in the courtyard outside the entrance. Teachers, former students, school board members, parents of current students, people from the community who had known Gerald in various capacities over a quarter-century of committed presence. I recognized faces from the farmer's market, from the library, from the neighborhood, from the cooperative. I had not fully understood until that moment how many people Gerald had touched, and how many of them were still carrying something of him. Robert Calloway found us near the entrance. He shook my hand and then William's, with the ease of someone who had been told about William and was already disposed to like him. Michael Calloway was beside his father, a man in his mid-30s with his father's frame and his own quiet watchfulness. He shook my hand and then held it for a moment. He used to keep a quote on the board, Michael said, above the periodic table. From Darwin. He said it every year at the beginning of the year. I can still hear him saying it. What was the quote? William asked. It is not the strongest of the species that survives, Michael said, and not the most intelligent. It is the one most adaptable to change. He smiled. He said it was about biology, but you could always tell he meant it about everything else too. I looked at this man whose father had gone to Gerald's memorial and stood in the back and said nothing, and who was standing here now 34 years later because Gerald had stayed after school on Tuesdays and Thursdays in the autumn of 2001, and given a boy who was failing biology enough patience and attention to change the direction of his life. And Michael had gone to Costa Rica and spent 11 years working for things that mattered because a biology teacher in a small city had decided that every student deserved someone willing to stay. The things we do without knowing they will last. The ceremony was simple and it was right. The principal spoke about Gerald's record, the specific and grounded facts of it, the number of students who had gone on to study sciences, the curriculum he had developed, the colleagues he had mentored, the particular quality of attention he had given to students who were struggling. Several former students spoke. One woman, who was now a pediatrician, said that Gerald Voss was the first adult who had ever told her she was capable of being a scientist, and that she thought about that conversation still 20 years later, whenever she needed to tell a child something true about themselves. When they unveiled the name above the entrance, I was not expecting what I felt, which was not grief exactly and not pride exactly, but something that contained both and went beyond them. Gerald Voss Science Wing, in clean sans serif letters on the glass, catching the May light. William was beside me. He did not say anything. He simply put his hand over mine where it rested at my side, which was exactly the right thing to do and exactly enough. Robert Calloway spoke last. He talked about what a school is and what it is not, the things that outlast any building or curriculum or administrative structure, which are the relationships between teachers and students and the way those relationships send ripples through time in directions no one can predict. He talked about the bridge between what someone teaches you and what you become, which is never a straight line, and which requires at its crucial joints someone willing to be present in the particular way that Gerald Voss had been present, without agenda, without performance, with full attention to the person in front of him. He did not mention Daniel. He did not mention the train station or the trust or the Glendon matter or any of the events of the previous months. None of that was part of this story, and Robert Calloway understood, as men of his character understand, that a moment of honoring deserves to be precisely what it is. But as he spoke I was aware, in the way you are aware of warmth from a fire you are not directly facing, that everything that had brought me to this courtyard on this morning was connected. The trust document and the phone call and the February bench and the hand over mine and the 42 minutes of company with a stranger who turned out to be not a stranger at all, but someone the world had placed there at the exact moment when the world understood that I needed to be reminded that decent people exist and are willing to lend you a phone without asking why. These things connect. They always have. After the ceremony there was food in the New Wings common room, the kind of community gathering that Gerald would have navigated with his particular skill of knowing everyone's name and having the right small question for each person. I did my best version of that. I talked to the pediatrician and to Michael Calloway and to 3 of Gerald's former colleagues from the science department, 2 of whom were retired now and 1 of whom was still teaching, a young woman who had been in Gerald's last class of Ments and who said, with the directness of someone who has not yet learned to soften things, that everything she knew about teaching she had learned from watching him. William circulated with me, comfortable in rooms full of strangers in the way of someone who has spent a life meeting people across cultures and contexts and has arrived at the understanding that most people, given the right opening, are interesting. He asked questions and listened to the answers and made the people he talked to feel that they had said something worth hearing, which is its own form of generosity. At one point I looked across the room and saw him talking with the young biology teacher, both of them leaning slightly over a display of photographs from the science department's history, and I thought about what it means to move through the world with the quality of presence that made people feel in his company that they mattered. Gerald had had that quality. Patrice had it. Franklin Osei had a version of it, more precise, more formal but real. And William had it in the particular form of a man who had been genuinely curious about the world for 73 years, and had not run out of things to be curious about. I thought, Gerald would have liked him very much. And then more quietly, Gerald would be glad. We walked back to the train station in the afternoon. The May light was different from the morning light, lower and more golden. The kind that makes everything look like a memory even while it's happening. The streets around the school were full of the ordinary activity of a Thursday afternoon. A woman walking a dog, 2 teenage boys on bicycles, a delivery truck with its hazards on outside a dry cleaner. The world conducting its regular business while, for blocks back, a building carried a name that would stay there for the rest of the building's life. Do you know what I keep thinking about? I said. William glanced at me. The probate timeline note, I said. The one Daniel had in his folder. Eleanor. Probate timeline with a question mark. He had stood in his home office and thought about the gap between my life expectancy and the moment his inheritance arrived. And he had written it down on a sticky note. And the gap was full, I said. The gap was completely full of things he hadn't accounted for. A lawyer his wife's mother had found through a library. A senior partner who had a son who passed biology in 2001. A train station bench in February. He was measuring an empty space and it wasn't empty at all. William was quiet for a few steps. Then he said, the most dangerous gaps are the ones that look empty. The civil engineering perspective, I said. He smiled. And the human one. We reached the station. We bought coffee from the cart near the entrance. A luxury I had been exercising since February. The ability to buy myself a cup of coffee at a train station without asking permission of anyone. We sat on a bench, not the bench where I had sat in February, But nearby, in the same waiting area with the same flickering fluorescent light that nobody had fixed since February and which I had developed a fondness for. "I want to tell you something," William said. He held his coffee cup in both hands, looking at the departure board. "When I sat down next to you in February, I thought you were someone who had been through something hard that morning and who could use company without being asked if they wanted it. I did not have any thought beyond that. I did not know whose mother you were or who your lawyer was or what you had spent the previous 4 months building. I just thought, that woman needs someone to sit beside her." "I know," I said. "What I'm telling you is that it wasn't strategy," he said. "It was just, I think the word is recognition. I recognized something in how you were sitting there. The particular way a person holds themselves when they are dealing with something difficult and doing it without anyone watching." I looked at him. "My wife Amara," he said. "She was sick for 3 years before she died. She sat in a lot of waiting rooms. I learned to recognize the posture." "I'm sorry," I said. He nodded slowly. "She would have found all of this very funny," he said. "The train station in Franklin and the probate sticky note and the science wing. She had a strong sense of the absurd. She would have made a joke about the universe having terrible timing and impeccable taste." I laughed. It came out properly, fully, the kind of laugh that surprises you. He smiled at his coffee cup. "There it is," he said. We took the 4:15 back to Millhaven. We talked most of the way, though there were stretches of comfortable quiet, the kind that has stopped needing to be filled. When we pulled into Millhaven station and the train slowed and the platform came into view through the window, I looked out at it and felt something settle. I said, "My husband planted a dogwood tree in the garden when our first grandchild was born. He said every new person deserved a tree." William looked at me. "It's in full bloom right now," I said. "Past full bloom, actually. Going soft at the edges. But still beautiful." He understood what I was saying because he was the kind of man who understood what people were saying when they said things sideways, which is how the important things are usually said. "I'd like to see it," he said. "If you'd be willing to show me." "I would," I said. "Come for dinner on Saturday. I'll make the groundnut soup. We can compare versions." His face did the thing with the eyes half a second before the mouth. Gerald's kind of smile. "That sounds exactly right," he said. The platform arrived. We gathered our things, the way travelers do, with the small competent motions of people who know how to arrive somewhere. The doors opened. We stepped out into the Millhaven evening. Claire called me that night, as she often did. The children were in bed, she said, and the house was quiet, and she had been painting, which she had been doing every evening lately, the large canvases that didn't quite resolve into shapes but felt like something. "How was the ceremony?" she asked. "It was right," I said. "It was exactly right." She was quiet for a moment. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Always. Do you think people can actually change?" She paused. I don't mean that as a question about Daniel specifically. I mean in general. Do you think people actually change, or do they just get better at managing what they are? I thought about this honestly because she deserved an honest answer. "I think change is rare," I said. "Real change, the kind that goes all the way down. But I think it happens. I think it requires someone being genuinely frightened of who they've been, not afraid of consequence but afraid of themselves. And I think it requires time and the willingness to be smaller than you want to be while you figure out who you actually are." She was quiet. "I've seen it once or twice in my life," I said. "And Gerald, actually in his 30s. He had a period when he was more careful with himself than with other people. It took him a few years to understand that and turn it around. He was a better man at 50 than he was at 35, and a better man at 65 than he was at 50. The change was real." She said, "He never told me that." No, he wouldn't have. He wasn't someone who made his growth a performance. He just grew and let the growing speak. She was quiet for a long time. Then, "I'm going to figure it out. Whatever I decide, I'm going to figure it out on my own terms. I know you are. And I'm going to keep painting." "Good. And Mom, I'm sorry for not seeing what was happening sooner. For letting his version of you get louder than the real one." I said what I had said before because it was still true and would keep being true. "You are my daughter. The rest is details." She breathed out. "'Kay," she said. "Okay. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a while in Gerald's chair. In the quiet of the house that was entirely mine. The refrigerator hummed. The garden was dark outside the window, but I knew everything that was in it. The dogwood past its peak and still beautiful. The rose cane sending up new growth that by July would be full and wild. The vegetable beds I had turned over last week that were now quietly deciding what they were going to become. I thought about the bench in the train station in February. The empty hands. The cold that I had finally noticed after 20 minutes when the shock had begun to thin. And then the man in the gray overcoat who sat at a respectful distance and looked at the departure board and said, "You look like you've had a morning." The world had been paying attention. I had spent 67 years moving through it carefully and honestly, and with as much kindness as I could manage on the days when kindness came easily and on the days when it required genuine effort. I had planted things and tended them and trusted that something was listening even when there was no evidence. And then there was a February morning and a bench and a phone and a senior partner who had a son who had failed biology and a sticky note that said probate timeline with a question mark. And the world had paid it all back, not in the way you expect, not in a straight line, but in the improbable and abundant way that Gerald always said the world repaid things sideways through a door you weren't watching all at once. I got up and turned off the kitchen light. I walked through the dark house to the bottom of the stairs, where the newel post had a small chip in the wood from a bicycle Marcus had ridden into it 2 Christmases ago, which I had decided not to repair because it was the kind of mark that belongs to a house that has been lived in fully. I went upstairs to bed. Outside, the May night was warm and the garden was dark, and somewhere in the house the particular smell that I had never been able to attribute to anything specific was present. The thing that was simply the smell of a home that had been loved for a very long time by people who meant it. Tomorrow there would be more to do. There always was. The watercolor class and the cooperative. And the Thursday train and dinner on Saturday and the phone calls and the grandchildren and the ongoing ordinary work of a life that had a great deal of it left. Gerald had been right about many things, but about this most of all: home is not a place. Home is the people you love and the life you build together, and you can build it anywhere. And you can keep building it long past the point where anyone would think there was still building to be done. I was 67 years old and I had been left at a train station in February and I had come home, and the roses were coming back, and dinner on Saturday was going to be exactly right. That's the whole story. Except that it wasn't, of course, because the best stories never fully close. They simply reach a point where the ground is solid enough to stand on and the next part hasn't been written yet. Which is exactly where I intended to be. The Saturday dinner happened the way good things happen when you stop trying to control the shape of them. I had spent Friday afternoon in the kitchen in the way I used to spend Friday afternoons when Gerald and I were first married and had people coming for dinner, and I was still young enough to be nervous about it. Not nervous now. Something closer to deliberate. I made the soup from a recipe William had described on the phone with the selective vagueness of someone who measures by instinct rather than measurement, which meant I had to call him twice to clarify quantities, and he had answered both times with the unhurried patience of someone who did not mind being called. The second call had lasted 40 minutes. We had started with the soup and ended somewhere in a conversation about whether the particular quality of light in certain cities was something real that could be attributed to geography and atmosphere, or whether it was a story people told because places needed stories. William said Accra in the early morning had a light he had never found language for. I said that the light in this kitchen in October, when the sun came through the window at a particular angle in the late afternoon, was the reason I had never seriously considered living anywhere else, even during the years when living anywhere else might have made financial sense. He had been quiet for a moment after that, in the way that meant he was filing something rather than simply letting it pass. The soup was ready by 5. I had also made bread, because bread is the kind of thing that tells a person you were glad they were coming before they have even walked through the door. I had set the table in the kitchen rather than the dining room because the dining room is for occasions and the kitchen is for people, and this felt like a people evening rather than an occasion one. William arrived at 6 with a bottle of wine he had clearly given some thought to and a small paper bag that turned out to contain a container of his version of the soup, sealed and labeled in his handwriting, which was architectural and precise in the way of someone trained to communicate through drawings. For comparison purposes, he said when he handed it to me. I looked at the label. It said, WO version. Handle with appropriate skepticism. I laughed. He came inside. The kitchen received him the way I had hoped it would, which is to say it did not make him a stranger. He stood at the counter while I poured wine and looked at the things on the walls, the calendar from the garden cooperative, the watercolor I had done of the back garden that my instructor had said showed real confidence, the photograph of Gerald and me on the porch taken by Marcus 3 summers ago when Marcus had discovered that he liked taking photographs of people when they weren't performing for the camera. "That's a good photograph," William said. "Gerald always looked better when he didn't know someone was looking," I said. William looked at it for another moment. "He has a kind face," he said. "He did," I said. Past tense was still sometimes an effort even 3 years on, and I did not try to hide that. William noticed and did not comment on it, which was the right thing. We sat down to eat. The soup comparison was conducted seriously and with genuine debate. His version had more ginger and a quality of heat that built slowly rather than announcing itself, which he said was the correct approach and I said was a matter of legitimate disagreement, and he said perhaps we should call it regional variation rather than one of us being right, which I allowed. The bread was, by common agreement, not a competition. We talked through dinner and through the clearing up and through the wine afterward at the kitchen table. The way people talk when they have discovered that the conversation has more in it than either of them expected, and neither of them is in any particular hurry to find the bottom of it. He told me about the bridge project in West Africa, which had been a road bridge over a river that flooded seasonally and cut a village off from its market town for 3 months of every year. He described the engineering problem with the specificity of someone who still found it interesting decades later, which is the sign of a person who chose the right work. He described the people in the village, the chief who had very precise ideas about where the bridge should land and had turned out to be right on structural grounds in a way that still impressed William when he thought about it. He had a way of telling stories that gave full weight to the other people in them, not just as background to his own experience but as people whose choices and perspectives had shaped things. I thought about Daniel and how his stories always had him at the center and everyone else as supporting cast, and then I put that thought away because Saturday dinner with William Osei was not the right container for thoughts about Daniel. I told him about the watercolor class and the painting I was working on, which was a series of the neighborhood at different times of day, an attempt to understand what my instructor meant when she talked about light as a subject rather than a condition. I told him about Patrice and the 40 years of friendship that had survived 2 cities, 3 career changes, 4 children between us, several significant losses, and a period in the early 1990s when we had not spoken for 8 months over a disagreement so thoroughly resolved that neither of us could accurately reconstruct what it had been about. He said, 8 months is a long time to be right about something. I said we were both wrong. That was the resolution. We were wrong in different directions and had to meet in the middle. He considered this. That's a more honest resolution than most, he said. Patrice is a more honest person than most. He wanted to know about the garden cooperative, which I had mentioned several times, and I found myself describing it with more enthusiasm than I usually brought to explaining it to people who hadn't been there, because William asked the specific questions that drew the specific answers. He wanted to know about the soil. He wanted to know about what the various members grew and whether there was any collective philosophy about it or whether everyone just did their own thing in adjacent plots. He wanted to know whether the relationships formed across the plots were different from other kinds of neighborly relationships, which I thought about carefully and said yes, they were, because there was a shared investment in conditions beyond anyone's control, the weather and the soil and the particular stubbornness of certain pests, that created a kind of lateral solidarity you didn't get in other settings. He said, that's what the best engineering projects do as well. The problem is bigger than any one person, so you end up actually needing each other. We stayed at the kitchen table until nearly 10, which is late for 2 people in their 7th decade who both have morning habits, and which neither of us remarked upon. When he stood to go, he looked around the kitchen one more time with the attentive sweep of someone storing something. Thank you for this, he said. For all of it. Come again, I said. The roses will be out in June. They're worth seeing. He said he would come again, and I believed him in the specific way you believe things when they are said without performance. I closed the door behind him and stood in the hallway for a moment in the quiet. Gerald, I said to the house. The house was quiet back, the way it always was, which I had stopped interpreting as absence and started interpreting as a kind of presence that didn't need to announce itself. I turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs, and the house settled around me the way it always did, with the small sounds of old wood and known rooms and the particular piece of a space that has been loved for a very long time. June arrived with the roses. Gerald had planted 3 varieties along the back fence, a deep red climber that he had always called the reliable one, a pale pink shrub rose that was more fragrant than beautiful, and a yellow orange that had taken 4 years to establish and then had proceeded to behave as though the fence were merely a suggestion. By the second week of June all 3 were in full, extravagant bloom, and the garden in the morning had the quality of a room that has been decorated by someone with strong opinions and no budget constraints. William came on a Saturday in the second week of June, and stood at the back door looking out at the garden with the expression of someone reassessing a previous estimate. "You said they were worth seeing," he said. "I said they were usually worth seeing. Some years they surpass themselves." He was quiet for a moment. "Is there a word for when something is more beautiful than you expect it even though you were expecting it to be beautiful?" "Gerald would have known one," I said. "He was good with language. I just knew what I was looking at." We had coffee in the garden that morning, in the 2 chairs I had pulled out of the shed and set on the patch of flagstone near the rose fence. The morning was warm without the weight that summer acquires later, when the heat becomes structural. We sat and drank coffee and said very little because very little needed to be said. The roses did not require commentary. His granddaughter, Nadia, had presented her science project and it had gone well. She was 15 and wanted to study structural engineering, which William described with a careful neutrality that did not fully conceal his satisfaction. He said she asked better questions than most adults he had worked with, which I believed entirely. I told him about Sophie's most recent drawing, which had expanded from the 2-horse plan to include a stable and a field and what appeared to be a small cottage for me to live in when I visited, which Sophie had labeled Grandma's house with the specific detail of a child who intends to be taken seriously. He said, "She's building you into her future." "Yes," I said. "Children do that and then they grow up and they do it differently. But Sophie at 8 is building futures that include everyone she loves with absolute certainty that they want to be included. That's a gift she has," he said. "She has her father's." I stopped. He waited without pressure. "She has her father's ability to organize a vision," I said. "Whatever Daniel does with the rest of his professional life, that quality in Sophie came from somewhere real in him." William looked at his coffee. "That's generous." "It's accurate," I said. "Which is different from generous, though it can look the same from the outside." He looked at me. "You're very precise about that line," he said. "I've had to be. You start blurring accuracy and generosity and eventually you stop being able to see clearly. And clear seeing has been the most useful tool I have for most of my life." He nodded slowly. "Amara was like that," he said. "She had a phrase for it. She called it." Father had apparently described the garden in June with a precision and warmth that Franklin said was not his father's usual register for describing anything. "He seems well," Franklin said. "He is," I said. "Good," he said, with the tone of a son who has decided to stay out of a situation, and is genuinely pleased with how the situation is going without him. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. It was Franklin's call that prompted me to do something I have been thinking about for several months. I drove to the county library on a Thursday morning when there was no watercolor class and I sat with a reference librarian named Carol, the same Carol who had pointed me toward the list of estate attorneys 14 months before, and I told her what I wanted to do. "I want to establish a fund," I said. "Something that operates through the library. For older adults who need legal consultation about estate planning or housing rights or financial arrangements, and who don't have the resources to access it privately." Carol looked at me over her reading glasses with the expression of someone who has spent 30 years helping people find the right resource and recognizes when someone has arrived at the right resource through their own hard path. "We've been looking for something like this for years," she said. What I was offering was not large in absolute terms. The rental income from the Birchwood property was reliable, and the trust structure meant I had more financial flexibility than Daniel had ever known or accounted for. What I was offering was enough to fund 12 consultations per year with the firm of Calloway and Associates, specifically with Franklin Osei, whose initial consultation rate Franklin had agreed, without needing much persuasion, to hold at a level accessible to people on fixed incomes. It would be called the Gerald Voss Community Legal Fund, which Carol wrote down in her precise librarian's handwriting with the kind of attention that told me it was already real. The first recipient, 8 weeks later, was a 71-year-old woman named Doris Hartley who had been living with her son and daughter-in-law for 2 years after her husband's death and who had begun to feel, as the months passed, that her financial arrangements and her living situation and her own legal rights were becoming unclear in ways she couldn't quite name. She came to the library on a Tuesday. Carol gave her Franklin's number. Franklin saw her on Thursday. I did not meet Doris Hartley. I didn't need to. What I knew was that she had called the library on a Friday to thank someone, and Carol had called me to pass it along, and I had sat at the kitchen table in Gerald's chair and thought about Patrice's words from February. You never ask for help. And then you do it and it costs the other person almost nothing and gives you almost everything. The fund was the version of that running in the other direction. The giving rather than the receiving. The cost to me was real but manageable. The everything it gave to Doris Hartley was hers alone to measure. November came, and with it the particular quality of light that had always been Gerald's favorite, the low gray skies and the bare trees and the way the garden looked stripped back to its architecture, showing you what it was made of before the growing started again. I had always found November melancholy until Gerald pointed out, some years ago now, that it was simply the garden being honest about itself, which was not the same as being depleted. William came for Thanksgiving. He brought his daughter Angela, who had driven in from Baltimore with her husband Jerome and their 2 children, Nadia the aspiring engineer and a younger boy named Sam who had the focused energy of a child working very hard on something the adults around him couldn't quite identify. Claire and Daniel and Marcus and Sophie came with a sweet potato dish that Sophie had helped make, and which Marcus described as containing a dangerous quantity of brown sugar, which Sophie corrected to the exact right quantity. I had been slightly nervous about it, if I'm honest. Not about the people individually but about the specific social chemistry of a table full of people, some of whom were meeting for the first time in circumstances that required no explanation but also contained layers that required either everyone to be tactful or everyone to simply be themselves. I have always preferred the latter and hoped for it, and the table delivered it. Angela was a pediatric nurse and had the directness about it that nurses have about what actually matters. She asked good questions and laughed easily and had clearly been briefed about the train station story by William, because she looked at me at one point across the table with the specific warm recognition of someone who has been told you were impressive and is deciding whether the reality matches the account, and I apparently passed because she leaned over toward the end of the meal and said quietly, "My father talks about this kitchen like it's somewhere he's been going for years." "It's a new development," I said. "Maybe," she said. "But the way he talks about it isn't new." I thought about that for a while after dinner when the kitchen was full of people and noise and the ordinary beautiful chaos of too many people trying to help clear up, Marcus and Nadia in deep discussion about something school-related, Sophie showing Sam the drawing of the stable revision, Jerome and Daniel at the sink with the easy focused competence of 2 men who understand that dishes are not complicated and just require doing, Claire and Angela at the kitchen table in the first stages of what looked like it might become a real conversation, William standing near the back door looking out at the dark garden with the patient alertness of someone who knows what's keeping the accounts honest. Not in a harsh way. Just not letting sentiment rewrite what actually happened. "I like that," I said. "She would have liked you," he said. He said it simply, without the careful hedge people usually put around such statements, and I received it the same way. The roses bloomed and then the summer deepened and the cooler weather of late August arrived with its particular quality of light, everything sharper at the edges and the garden beginning its transition toward whatever it was going to become next. The cooperative had a harvest gathering the last Saturday of August that I had been attending for 3 years, a potluck in the common space with tables set up between the plots and everyone bringing something they had grown. I had brought tomatoes and basil and a jar of the jam I had made from the small strawberry patch in the corner of my plot, and I had brought William, who carried the bread he had made that morning and who moved through the gathering with the ease of someone who understood that the correct approach to any community event was genuine curiosity about the people rather than management of an impression. He talked for a long time with a man named Ezra who had the plot next to mine and who grew primarily root vegetables with the focused dedication of someone with a serious position on the matter. Ezra was 75 and had grown up in Jamaica and had been in Millhaven for 40 years, and had opinions about soil composition that he had been trying to share with me for 3 years with only partial success because I had been tending my plot the way Gerald taught me and had not been fully open to revision. William asked Ezra 3 questions about drainage and pH that demonstrated a working knowledge of the subject, and Ezra's face did the thing it does when he encounters someone willing to actually engage, and by the end of the afternoon they had exchanged phone numbers and Ezra had promised William a full consultation on whatever garden he eventually established. On the drive home, William said, "He's been waiting for someone to ask about the drainage. He's been waiting for someone to take him seriously about the drainage," I said. "There's a difference." He laughed. "You and your differences." "The differences matter," I said. "That's why I keep track of them." It was around this time, late summer moving into autumn, that the situation with Daniel and Claire reached its own form of resolution, which was not dramatic and was not clean and was, in its way, more honest than either of those things would have been. Claire called me on a Tuesday evening with the quality of voice that meant she had been sitting with something all day, and had finally decided to say it out loud. "I've decided to stay," she said. "With Daniel. In the marriage." I waited. "Not because I think everything is fine or because I've forgiven everything," she said, "but because I've watched him for 7 months and I think the frightened version of him is closer to who he actually is than the version I was afraid of. And I think that's workable. For both working." "Is he working?" I asked. "He's in therapy," she said. "He's been going every week since March. He doesn't talk about it much, but I can tell it's real. He comes home from those appointments quieter than usual in a way that means something happened rather than nothing." She paused. "And he's been different with the children. Not performing being a good father. Actually being present with them in a way he wasn't before." I said, "What does your gut tell you?" She was quiet for a moment. "My gut tells me that the worst thing he's capable of has already happened and that he knows it." She paused again. "My gut also tells me that I am capable of more than I've been allowing myself to be, and that staying in this marriage is going to require me to be more, not less. Which is terrifying and also feels right. Those two things can coexist," I said. "I know. That's the part I've been sitting with all day." There was a long, comfortable pause. "Mom," she said, "are you happy?" I thought about the question, which deserved real thought. "I am building something," I said. "Which is the version of happy that I have most respect for." She was quiet for a moment. "Is it William?" "It is several things," I said. "William is one of them. The garden is one of them. The watercolors. Patrice. You and the children. The house. The fact that the house is mine in the complete legal sense that it should always have been. All of those things together." "That's a good answer," she said. "It's an honest one." "Marcus and Sophie," she said. "They're going to want to see you this weekend. Sophie has revised the stable plan again. There's now a room in the main house specifically for William, which she has labeled Mr. Williams' room with what I can only describe as executive confidence." I laughed. "She's very certain about things," Claire said, with the warmth of a mother who has given up trying to moderate her daughter's certainty and has decided to simply admire it. "She comes by it honestly," I said. "On several sides. The autumn brought its own texture, the garden cooperative's final harvest and the shutting down of the plots for winter and Ezra's triumphant point-by-point explanation of how his drainage adjustment had improved his carrot yield, which he delivered to William over coffee in my kitchen with the satisfaction of a man who has finally been given the right audience. The watercolor class moved inside, which changed the quality of the work in ways my instructor said were interesting and I said were challenging, and we agreed were both. Franklin Osei called in October with a final piece of paperwork related to the trust documentation, a minor adjustment to the successor trustee provisions that had come up during a routine review, and we talked for 20 minutes about the trust and for 10 minutes about William, because Franklin had met his father for lunch the previous Sunday and his out there and is simply glad to be near it. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, in the middle of all of it, and felt something that I want to try to describe accurately because it deserves accuracy. It was not triumphant. It was quieter than that and more complete. It was the feeling of a house doing what a house is for, which is not shelter in the bare sense but the specific thing of holding the people you love in one place at one time and keeping them warm while they remember who they are to each other. Gerald had believed this about the house with a depth of conviction that had occasionally struck me as sentimental, and that I now understood had simply been accurate. He had known the house the way he had known his biology, from the inside, with the particular attention of someone who understood that the thing in front of him was alive and worth taking seriously. I thought, Gerald, look at this. And then I thought, which is not something I say often and which I say now with full sincerity, I believe he could. In December, 2 weeks before Christmas, Daniel came to the house alone. He called first, which was right, and he came on a Saturday afternoon when the sky was white and cold and the garden had gone entirely to winter. I made tea and we sat at the kitchen table across from each other, which by now had the particular quality of a place where honest things had been said and could be said again. He looked better than he had in March. Not restored exactly, because restoration implies returning to a previous state, and the previous state had been a performance. He looked like someone who had been taken apart carefully and put back together with less decoration and more structural integrity. The managed pleasantness was entirely gone. What was there instead was quieter and less certain and considerably more real. He said, I want to tell you something that I've been working up to. I said, go ahead. He said, I have been in therapy since March, which you know. What you don't know is what the work has been about. He looked at his tea. My therapist has a phrase she uses. She says I spent most of my adult life treating relationships like acquisitions. Identify value, secure the asset, extract maximum return, minimize holding cost. He said it without irony, which meant he had said it enough times that it had lost the self-consciousness that would have made it a performance. He knew exactly what it meant and he was not using it to manage my impression of him. I know, I said. I know you know, he said. That's part of what I'm trying to say. I have spent the last 9 months understanding that the most important person in my wife's life had my number from the beginning, and I never noticed because I had categorized her as a low-priority asset with a useful inheritance attached. He looked up from his tea. That's what you were to me, he said. I need to say it out loud to you specifically because I need to stop letting the softer version be the one on record. I looked at this man who had written Probate timeline with a question mark and left me at a train station in February, and I thought about accuracy versus generosity, and I thought about Gerald being a better man at 50 than at 35, and I thought about Claire's voice when she talked about the quieter version of Daniel that came home from therapy on Thursdays. I said, What do you want from me, Daniel? He shook his head. Nothing, he said. That's the point. I'm not here for something. I'm here because I owe you an accounting that I've been avoiding. A full one. Not the managed version where I express regret in terms designed to minimize my exposure. He paused. My therapist calls it making a repair. Not to fix everything. Just to put the real thing where the managed version was. I looked at him for a long moment. All right, I said. I received that. I want to say something back and I want you to receive it the same way. He nodded. I don't carry this as a wound, I said. I carried it for about 20 minutes on a train station bench in February, and then I picked up the tools I had prepared and I used them, and the situation resolved in the way it resolved. What I carry is the information about who you are when you believe you're dealing with someone who can't fight back. That information is mine to keep, not because I intend to use it against you, but because I'm 67 years old and I have earned the right to see clearly. He absorbed that. What I want for my daughter and my grandchildren, I said, is a home that is honest. Not a home where everything is fine. A home where people are actually who they say they are and say what they actually mean. If that is what you are building in that house on Bellwood Drive, then I am glad of it and I will support it with everything I have. If it isn't, I will see that too. He said. I understand. I said, good. We finished our tea. He helped me carry the cups to the sink and wash them, which was the kind of small, unremarkable action that means something when it comes from a man who had previously moved through other people's kitchens as a visitor. He dried the cups and put them back in the cabinet, not exactly where I kept them but close enough, and he looked at the cabinet for a moment as if making a note of the right location. Before he left, he stopped in the hallway where the photograph of Gerald and me hung, the one Marcus had taken on the porch 3 summers ago. He has a kind face, Daniel said. He did, I said. He stood there for a moment. Then he said, I understand why Franklin Osei stayed after school. I looked at him. Gerald, he said. I understand why he stayed after school with Robert's son for 3 months. Because some people he stopped. Some people just do the right thing so consistently that you stop noticing it as a choice. It becomes what they are. He shook his head slightly. I've been trying to understand what that feels like from the inside, he said. Whether it's something you learn or something you are, or whether there's a version of it that someone like me can actually access, or whether I missed the window when it forms. I said. Gerald would say it forms new every morning. That it's a decision you make again each day, not a quality you either have or don't. He would say you missed no window. He would say the window is open right now. Daniel was quiet for a long time. I hope he's right, he said. He usually was, I said. He left. I stood in the hallway for a moment after the door closed, in the silence that is not absence, and then I went back to the kitchen and put the kettle on again because it was a cold afternoon and I felt like another cup. Christmas came and went with the texture of a Christmas that is neither perfectly smooth nor perfectly difficult but is real, which is what Christmases with actual families are like. Marcus and Sophie and Claire and Daniel came for Christmas Eve, and William came for Christmas Day with Angela and Jerome and the children, and there were 2 days of the house being full and loud and warm and messy in exactly the right ways. Sophie gave William a drawing of the garden that she had made from a photograph she'd taken in June when the roses were out, which he received with a gravity appropriate to a serious artistic gift. Sam took apart and reassembled a small mechanical puzzle 47 times in a row, which suggested to me that Nadia was not the only engineer in the next generation of that family. Marcus and Nadia formed a 2-person committee on the subject of whether the canal bridge in William's bridge photograph was structurally more interesting than a suspension bridge, a committee that debated its findings over 2 days without reaching consensus, which is the sign of a genuine intellectual question. Daniel, on Christmas Eve, helped Marcus with the dishes without being asked, and when Marcus knocked a glass off the counter and it broke, Daniel said it's just a glass in a voice that was so unmanaged and immediate that Claire looked up from across the room with an expression I had not seen on her face in a very long time. January arrived cold and clear, and I went back to the watercolor class and the garden cooperative and the Thursday trains and the Saturday dinners that had become the reliable rhythm of those weeks. I had begun a new series of paintings, less topographical than the neighborhood series, more interested in interiors. The kitchen at various times of day. The garden in its winter architecture. The hallway in the particular light of a winter afternoon. My instructor said the work had acquired a quality she described as inhabited, which was the word she used when a painting understood that the space it depicted was not empty. I thought about that word for several days. Inhabited. Not about the painting specifically but about the year behind me. The house on Birchwood Lane, which had been full and then emptied and then full again in the ways that matter. The guest room in the Hearst house where I had sat and watched and understood and planned. The train station bench in February. The conference room where I had sat with Robert Calloway and talked about what I wanted with the precision of someone who had had a very long time to think about it. Inhabited. All of it. By people who were present rather than passing through. Who were there because they had chosen to be rather than because they had nowhere else to be. Franklin called in late January with what he described as a small development that he thought I would find interesting. Robert Calloway, he said, has been asked to speak at the State Bar Association's annual conference on the subject of elder financial protection and estate planning. He is planning to reference the Gerald Voss Community Legal Fund as an example of community-initiated legal access. He wants your permission to do so. I said of course. He also wants to know whether you would be willing to come. As a guest. Not to speak. Simply to be in the room. I thought about this. Tell him yes, I said. Tell him I'll be in the room. The conference was in March, which brought the year around to where it had started and then a full rotation forward. I drove to the city on a Thursday morning, which meant I took the 9:15 with William, who had been invited by Franklin as his guest and who came in a suit that fit him well and with the ease of someone who had been in many rooms over a long career, and had long since stopped needing those rooms to confirm anything about him. The conference hall was full of attorneys and estate planners and people from non-profit organizations concerned with elder rights, which is a community whose existence I had not been aware of 14 months ago, and which I was now aware of with the specific gratitude of someone who needed a thing to exist and found it already there. Robert Calloway spoke for 40 minutes. He spoke about the gap between legal protection in theory and legal access in practice, about the populations most at risk when that gap was not addressed, about the specific vulnerability created by the intersection of modest income and family complexity in later life. He spoke without naming names and without specific cases, but with a precision of understanding that I recognized as someone who had looked at these things directly and recently rather than through the lens of professional abstraction. When he mentioned the Gerald Voss Community Legal Fund, he described it as established by a woman who had personal cause to understand the gap and who had, with characteristic practicality, decided to address it rather than simply to have experienced it. I was in the fourth row. I did not stand or wave or indicate in any way that this was me. William was beside me. He did not look at me during this section of the speech. He looked at the stage, and I felt his hand find mine in the dark of the fourth row, and I left it there. After the conference there was the particular social hour that follows conferences where people circulate with purpose and without it in equal measure. Robert Calloway found us near the window. He shook William's hand with the warmth of a man glad to meet someone he's heard about, and then he shook mine with both of his the way he always did, the gesture that meant more than a handshake could usually carry. "How does it feel?" he asked. "To have started something." "Strange," I said. "Good. Slightly alarming. The way things feel when they stop being plans and start being real." He nodded. "Gerald was like that about his programs," he said. "Always slightly surprised when they worked. He told Michael once that you had to be slightly surprised when things worked or you started to confuse the plan with the outcome." "That sounds exactly like him," I said. Robert looked at me for a moment. "I want to say something that I've been meaning to say since May," he said. "Since the ceremony. About the way things connected. The train station and Franklin and all of it." I waited. "I've been a lawyer for 37 years, he said. "I've seen a great many cases involving families and money and the things people do to each other when money and family intersect. And what strikes me about this particular situation is not the legal architecture, which was elegant, or the professional outcome, which was appropriate, but the thing that drove the legal architecture. The fact that you spent 4 months building protection not out of fear or vengeance but out of clarity. Because you had seen clearly and decided to act clearly, and that was all." He paused. "That's rarer than it should be," he said. I thought of Gerald's chair. The kitchen table. The quiet months of building something that held. "Gerald always said clarity was the most underrated form of courage," I said. Robert said he was right. We drove back to Millhaven in the late afternoon, William and I, through the marsh landscape that was still bare but had the specific quality of something working underneath it, the early decision-making that happens below the surface before the visible changes begin. I had my coat off in the car because the heater worked well, and the sun was doing more than it had been a month ago. William said, "Franklin asked me something this morning before the conference." "What?" He asked how I was finding Millhaven. I looked out the window at the passing fields. "What did you say?" he said. I told him I was finding it very well. I kept my eyes on the fields. And he nodded, William said, in the manner of a son who has decided to stay out of a situation but is glad to see where it's going. I laughed. He kept his eyes on the road, but I could see the side of his face, the thing that happened in his eyes before it reached his mouth. We drove in comfortable quiet for a while, the kind of quiet that is not the absence of things to say but the presence of so many things to say that you are simply choosing which one to say first. I said, "There's a carriage house at the back of the Birchwood property. Needs work. It's been storage for years, but the bones of it are good." William was quiet for a moment. "Gerald always meant to convert it into a proper studio space," I said. "For him, not for me. He had plans for a workshop where he could build furniture on a larger scale. He drew the plans in his small notebook. I still have them." The road curved and the city came briefly into view in the distance and then was gone again behind the hills. "The bones are very good," I said. "It has good light. West-facing windows." Gerald was precise about the windows. William said, "It would be a significant project." "It would," I said. He said, "I know something about structural bones. What holds and what doesn't." "I know," I said. He was quiet for another mile. Then, "How long have you been thinking about this?" "Since June," I said. "Since the Saturday in the garden when you looked at the roses and asked whether there was a word for something more beautiful than you expected, even when you were expecting it to be beautiful. He drove for a while without speaking, and I watched the fields go by, the earth doing its invisible work, the whole landscape in the early stages of becoming something the surface hadn't caught up with yet. It would need a proper structural assessment, he said. I said, I know a civil engineer. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but contained one. We came into Millhaven as the late afternoon light was going golden over the rooftops, the particular February orange of street lights not yet on and the sun not yet down, the in-between light that has always seemed to me to be the most honest light of the day, the light in which things are neither dramatized nor diminished but simply seen. He pulled into the Birchwood driveway and we sat for a moment in the car with the engine off, looking at the house, which looked back with the particular solidity of something that has been standing for a long time and intends to keep standing. In the spring, I said. When the light is right. He said. I'll bring my notebook. I got out of the car and he walked me to the door, and the door opened with the slight resistance at the top that Gerald had always meant to fix and never got around to. And inside the house was warm and the particular smell of it rose up to meet us, and William Osei crossed the threshold of Birchwood Lane for the first time, not as a dinner guest arriving at a set hour but as a person stepping into a place that had been making room for him. I believe some rooms do that. I believe they make room. I believe that houses, the ones loved right, understand something about continuation that we are only occasionally wise enough to trust. The kettle was on within 5 minutes because that is what you do in a kitchen that has been a kitchen for 34 years, and the late afternoon light came through the window at the angle I had described on the phone in January, the angle that was the reason I had never seriously considered living anywhere else, and it landed on the table between us and made ordinary things look like they had been placed exactly there. That is the rest of the story. Which is also, if you'll allow me the small precision that seems right after everything, the beginning of the next one. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now, I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.